Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I am Catherine Bosibori, and I'm very, very much delighted to be part of this great conference. And today I'm going to talk about the legacies of colonialism in Africa. So this comes against the backdrop of the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 that saw the partition of Africa among European powers. That before I even speak about the legacies that colonialism left in Africa, it is important we note that Africa is not a country. It is a continent like any other continent in the world, with people from different countries, cultures, ethnicities, and diversities. Even within one African country, we have people from different communities, and these communities are defined by different ways of life. And therefore, to discuss the legacies of colonialism in Africa, it is not practical to give these legacies in Africa in totality. So you realize that one legacy could be in one country or in one community, and another one could be in another one. So you realize that we cannot generalize all the legacies, to Africa. Some apply to some countries and some to some communities, and some do not apply to other countries or to other regions. It's also important to note that the colonial masters that came to Africa were not one monolithic group. Yes, they came from Europe as a continent, but they also came from different countries, and they also had different approaches and methodologies and perception about the people that they were going to colonize. So you see, both the colonialists and the colonized cannot be treated as one monolithic group. And I think for me to understand what actually colonialism did in Africa, we need to start from the point of defining who was the colonizer and what was informing what the colonizer was doing, not at general levels, but at individual country level of colonizers and at individual community levels of the colonizers, of the colonized, I mean. Sorry. So the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference has happened, and African cake has been shared among the European powers, and each country from Europe that was interested with colonies in Africa is in a rush to establish its sphere of influence, its protectorate, and its colonies in Africa. So eventually, colonial states are developed in Africa, and depending on the colonial power or on the European power that actually colonized a region, we have the French colonizing some parts of West Africa. We have the British in some parts of East Africa. We even have the Germans in Tanzania, etc. So this has happened, and the colonial state has been established. So it is important to note that when the colonialist comes to Africa at that particular time, early 1900s, etc., it's not like they're coming to a blank continent or to a blank slate and they're coming to write, whatever they want to write. They come, they find the people with a defined political, social, and economic organization. And therefore what they do, they come and disrupt this political, social, economic setup and replace it with their civilization, or with what they felt was right for them, that could help them achieve their missions and their goals in Africa. So the establishment of the colonial political economy embarks on 6 major things that I'm going to talk today. One of the areas that was impacted by colonialism was religion. The colonial political economy had no regard for the African traditional religion. So Mbidi has said that before colonialists came, Africans were extremely religious people. But this was not seen as the case by the white masters who've colonized Africa. When they came, they disrupted the religious institution in Africa. They brought in a Christian God, a God whose rules and principles were inscribed in a book, the Bible. And this God differed so greatly from the African God whose rules and regulations were written, in people's minds and hearts, etc. So with that, you realize that the religious institution was disrupted because the traditional way of worship in Africa was regarded as satanic, barbaric, and had to be done away with. So we saw, catechists, pastors, evangelists, etc. And these individuals replaced the roles and the presence and the work of the traditional religious administrators in African setup. So the role of the shears, prophets, healers in the traditional African setup was seen as barbaric and primitive, and it was done away. But the long-term impact of this Christianity can only actually be spoken in the current century from the religious extremes that we are experiencing down in Africa. We have had cases of people dying in the name of religion, in Kenya recently we had something called Shakahora, where people are fasting, they are not eating anything because they want to die and meet this Christian God. We have had the same cases in Uganda, people being burnt in a church in the name that they are going to see God, to heaven. But we have also had cases of, now we have the gospel of money, or commercialized gospel, where people are cropping up as pastors, people are establishing churches everywhere. And Christianity now is seen as the problem to have a solution. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's actually solving all the problems in Africa. We have people now, everything we have to run to prayer. Prayer is becoming like the solace of everything. And what we see are fake pastors and fake prophets, fake evangelists who are representing on innocent congregants who are taking religion as the opium. For them, religion is everything, and that's the religion is an opium of the people. It's something that actually we can trace from colonialism and the Christianity that it brought about, because it is a religion based on religiosity more than spirituality. So that's why we get even pastors who rape children, priests who rape the congregants. We have pastors and priests who are pedophiles. And because these are men of God, we cannot talk much about them. Because, no, men of God, they are not supposed to be questioned, but they are supposed to be prayed for. So as far as religion is concerned, apart from disrupting the religious system, but the branches of this legacy has gone extreme to this religious extremism and people hiding behind religion to doing wrong things in the society. Secondly, the second legacy I can talk about is the legacy on boundaries and ethnic disputes in Africa. The Berlin Conference happened in Europe. It was not anywhere in Africa. The people who sat to divide Africa among themselves had no idea about how Africa was, how the communities were, located and spread. So Africa was haphazardly divided among these European powers. Arbitral boundaries were drawn. So you realize that, for example, when you look at Kenya and Somalia, we have a community called the Somali. So the Somali, we have the Somalis in Somali, and we have the Somalis in Kenya. Ideally, these are people of the same ethnicity. But because of colonialism, they were divided into two. So what has happened is that there are always disputes. Sometimes these people, they were once one thing. They want to come together, but there's a boundary in between them. One community belongs to another country, and another community belongs to another country. The same thing, the Maasais in Kenya and the Maasais in Tanzania. So you realize that we have people of the same ethnicity in two different countries. And this has always brought a conflict. Because whenever there's a problem, The Somalis in Kenya will want to support the Somalis in Somalia. The Maasais in Kenya will want to support their brothers in Tanzania. So you realize that there's that, separation, forceful separation of communities, which later on has developed a very big crisis in Africa as far as ethnic groups and the clan disputes are concerned. Then there's the thing of ethnic boundaries or disputed boundaries, and these disputed boundaries range from nation to nation, community to community, and clans to clans. For example, recently, in 2022, if not 2021, we saw Kenya and Somalia at the International Court of Justice. The issue has to do with a maritime border. But it should also remind us that Kenya and Somalia, this is not the first time we have had them having border disputes. The North Frontier District in Kenya, it is a disputed region with Somalia. Somalia feels that it's her region. And Kenya feels, no, this is our region. But their problem is not these two countries. The problem has to do with the British administrators who came, established this North Frontier District, and when leaving in the early 1960s, they did not actually solve this problem. Actually, the British administrators in Kenya at that particular time said that they would not comment anything on that boundary until the new government in Kenya, that's the independent government, spoke about it. And when the new government of Kenya came into power, they did not want to speak about it because, nationalism issues, it is our country, it is our region. The Somalis also feel it's our region. And that's why when you look, for example, at the Somalia flag, you will realize that it is a 5-pointed star flag. And these 5 points have a meaning. It's not a declaration. One star points to the Northern Frontier District. Another one points to Jubaland. Another one points to Garden region. Another one points to the Djibouti region. So it tells you, like, Somalia feels these regions. They are the regions Somalia feels it's our territories that were given away forcibly. And it feels that this region should be claimed back. So you understand most of these conflicts and border disputes in the Horn of Africa as a result of forceful border drawings that led to separation of communities, but also borders that left nations and states in a situation where they can't tell whose region is this and how are we going to go about it. So there's a lot of conflict as a result of that. So what we see is, constant fights along the borders, insecurities along the borders, and to make matters worse is constant, threatened political and diplomatic ties between countries, something that is not nice for Africa. And this is one of the reasons why it is very difficult for Africa to unite as a continent and voice their grievances to the world because of these divided issues that are based from, you have our land, why should we even stand and form an alliance with you, all that. The third legacy, it had to do with the food crisis as a result of plantation agriculture in Kenya. The colonial political economy was characterized with the formation of the establishment of agricultural plantations, and these plantations were largely cash crop plantations. And I'm talking about cash crop plantations, I'm talking things like tea, coffee, sisal, berry-tran, cocoa, etc. This was not the case in the traditional African setup, where Africans used their lands for food crop production. Then we also had those communities that relied on nature, that is the hunter-gatherer economy. Then we also had those communities that relied on pastoralism, that's cattle keeping. So, and we also had those communities that relied on trade. So you see, traditionally, the African setup was a diversified continent in terms of, the modes of production and life means to livelihood. But here comes colonialism. They have set up their political economy that is characterized with large-scale farming, and this large-scale farming is basically based on cash crops. Now, when they left the country, they did not live with their cash crops, so they left these plantations, and this is the plantations that the independent country gets and takes over. And even when people go back to, those who manage to go back to their lands, because they are those ones who remain landless up to date, these are the cash crops that they get, and this is the kind of cash crops they continue with. So this is the kind of agriculture that is regarded to be the best agriculture, the modernized agriculture. And it becomes a problem to the African person after independence, because the factories that are set for these cash crops are primary processing factories. And these primary processing factories or industries, they cannot process the final product of, for example, coffee, from the coffee from the farm to the end product that we put on our tea, in our tea. So you realize that the industries set in Africa are those industries that remove the husks, remove the top things, make the load lighter for transportation and exportation to European countries. And 60 years down the line, those are the kind of industries that most African countries have. So you realize that yes, we have these cash crops, but there's a lot of middlemen in between the farmer up to the end product. So you realize that even the farmer at the down level of the ladder does not get actually rightfully what belongs to them. And this cash crop agriculture also needs a lot of care, a lot of farm input, etc. Something that most African farmers cannot afford. So we end up focusing on cash crop, and as a result, the food crop industry has been killed. Compounded with other factors, you realize that now, with less food crops being, or food cropping being done in the region or in Africa, hunger and starvation has become a thing in Africa. This was not the case in the pre-colonial African society, but now we see every time, aid in Africa, there are people dying in certain regions of Africa because of food, lack of food, starvation, etc. Why? Because people were drawn from, planting the indigenous crops that were drought resistant, things like sweet potatoes, things like cassava, things like yams. And, very few people think of putting those all, farming those ones, the tea, the coffee, the peretrum, large-scale maize production for sale now is the thing, and this is not doing good for African people as far as the African economy is concerned, and as far as hunger and starvation in the region is concerned. Another impact was on the marriage institution. It is the rarely spoken type of impact in the traditional African setup, vis-a-vis how colonialism impacted on it. I'm saying this because in the traditional African setup, marriage was highly celebrated, and the traditional marriage was marked by the payment of dowry, exchange between the two families, etc. But Christianity brought with it the white wedding. Down in Africa we call them the white wedding. And what's happening right now in Africa is that you could be married via the traditional means, where the two families meet and the dowry is paid. But that is not seen as marriage, but it's not seen as complete, especially with Christianity surrounding us, until you solemnize your marriage in church. That even when the state recognizes, 3 types of wedding, the traditional, the civil, and the church wedding, you realize that somebody has done the traditional wedding, moved to the, to the state wedding, because you cannot do the church wedding without the state certificate. So move to the state wedding, and then it solemnizes the marriage in church. So like literally people do 3 weddings or 3 marriages, so that they can be able to meet, with what Christianity and this white civilization in Africa has to talk about. So basically you realize that how marriage was done in the traditional African setup is not done. Some of the rights of marriage that were very essential in the traditional African setup are no longer done actually today. For example, you realize like the church wedding, they will tell you you only need 5 people for you to do your church wedding. That is the 2 couples, the minister, or the officiating office minister, and your witnesses, the best couple. That was not the case in the traditional African society, where marriage was for the community. You are getting married, my friend, we are coming to eat, we are coming to dance. The community is involved. A lot of things have to be done there. But nowadays, just people wake up in the morning, they move to the HE office, they do a wedding, they are done. The marriage is over. Before you know, people think, hey, we were married, we have a certificate, and that's all. So that's something that's actually changed. Now we're looking at the economies of scale in Africa right now. It's an economical wedding. But at the same time, it takes away our Ubuntu. You are because we are. The sharing is taken away. Nowadays we have invited only weddings. Invited only ceremonies. That was not the case in the traditional African society, where everybody came, everybody celebrated, and everybody was involved. Finally, the language and education. Before I move to the language education, I'm sorry. With relation to marriage, I also have to talk about gender issues. It has been long acclaimed that the traditional African setup was brutal towards women. There was gender discrimination, etc. Contrary to that, the traditional African society was set up in a way that both people, male and female, lived in a very coexisted, let me say that. When we talk that women had no access to land, we forget to tell the world that, yes, land was patriarchally owned, but we also had matriarchal societies. So where do you put the matriarchal societies when we're talking about land? At the same time, when we talk about that women were not allowed to access land, where do we put the women who used to, they were the ones who were cultivating that land, planting, removing the harvest, and preparing the harvest for storage? Women had their own kitchen gardens. And when colonialism came, with land alienation, their access to land was taken away. So it's not the traditional African setup that took away women access to land. It is colonialism and their land alienation and their patriarchal mentality that took away the African woman's voice as far as land and participation in the public sphere was concerned. Oyewumi, writing about the Igbo and in West Africa, talks about how an African woman was invented via colonialism. You realize that in the traditional African setup, we didn't have this separation, gender separations. And even our language does not show that we really had these, gender issues as far as the society was concerned. What we all know is that people needed to be protected, people needed to live in a very peaceful way. But colonialism, the colonialist people came, they came with their patriarchal mentality, gave education to women, to men alone, employed men alone, and left women in the reserves. And that started the mentality that women cannot participate in the public sphere. And that's what we have up to now. Finally, it has to do with the language. When you look at the language, today, if I'm in Africa, in a school, you realize that students, when they speak their mother tongue, they are beaten because they are supposed to speak English or French. So you see, this is another thing that has impacted on actually African setup. Our languages are being seen as primitive. A child who speaks good English and good French, or maybe good Germany, is regarded as a very intelligent child, the most civilized. They have seen the light of the world. So you realize that up to now, many parents are running away from their children learning their first languages, their mother tongues, because they want their children to be associated with the international language, the English language, the French language, and Germany, etc. So that one has impacted on the quality of our languages, because many people in the current generations speak very poor mother tongue. So meaning that some aspects of the traditional African language and mother tongue actually is fading away, because children have to speak English or to speak the languages of the colonizers. So that's said and done. Apart from those legacies that are mainly actually negative, I think there's a lot that can be done to reverse this. But just like it took, over 5 decades or 4 decades of colonialism in Africa, it will also take time, to erase these legacies and have, Africa that is free from the yoke of colonialism. Because in as much as the colonizers are away physically, the legacies that they left are still inscribed in the African way of life, the Africans' education, the African marriages, our languages, and the way we do things down in Africa. So those are the legacies. Those are some of the impacts of colonialism to Africa. And I really thank you so much for your time listening to me. And perhaps just in case of questions, I can get them via my email, kathleen@gmail.com.